Hello viewers, welcome to this lecture on environmental sociology, and today my topic is Chernobyl disaster and its aftermath, in which I shall be discussing one of the largest radioactive disaster in the world, which is Chernobyl explosion. The different objectives of today's lecture are to understand the actual cause of Chernobyl disaster, to know about the formation of the molten corium, to know about the short-term and long-term effects of Chernobyl disaster in different fields, including agriculture and food chain effect, to understand the radioactive debate that followed this Chernobyl disaster, and of course to know about the cultural impact and also tourism activities that actually was started lately around 2019. And finally, I will conclude with the impact of Ukraine-Russia war on Chernobyl. So the Chernobyl nuclear power plant is located 11 miles north of the city of Chernobyl. There were 4 reactors which produce 10% of the total Ukraine's electricity, and the construction started in 1970 and the 4 reactors were completed in 1983. And at the time of this explosion in reactor 4, the reactor number 5 and 6 construction were in progress. Actually, this was the Chernobyl nuclear plant, and the next figure shows the gradual melting of the nuclear reactor 4, which was definitely a man-made explosion because there were some errors involved. And it happened in April 26, 1986. It was mainly nuclear reactor malfunction, resulting in uncontrolled release of radioactive waste into the environment, and that actually lasted for 10 days. Of course, the location was Chernobyl in Ukraine, and the countries those were affected, that included Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. And it resulted in the elimination of radioactive iodine 131 and radioactive caesium, which is 137. And these radioactive materials settled down in the dust and debris, and they were also carried by wind to other neighboring countries of Europe or Eastern Europe. Actually, this is the nuclear reactor. So the uranium-filled rods, you can see here, they are heated, and this particular reaction of nuclear fission resulted in massive generation of heat, and because these rods are immersed in water, it generated huge amount of heat that produced steam from the water, as a result of which that resulted in the rotation of the turbine and generated power. So of course, the cooling is carried out by water, and normally this water is continually pumped in to prevent overheating. But what happened on April 26th? Most of these rods were not properly immersed in the water, as a result of which there was massive heat generated, and this overheating resulted in the fatal explosion in nuclear reactor number 4 in Chernobyl. And it caused enormous amount of leakage of radioactive fuel. We call it meltdown of the nuclear reactor. And the radiation spread all over, and what the government did at that point of time, they were dumping tons of sand and firefighters were employed without really considering the consequence of radiation to those poor people. And there were very little protective clothing which will protect them from radiation. And in fact, they were allowed to fight the fire or fight this particular dissolved reactor more than 1 minute, and that was dangerous. In fact, these people who were fighting the disaster, they were called the liquidators. And this process continued for almost 2 years. And ultimately, the fatal reactor were covered with a huge concrete tomb, and that was known as sarcophagus. In fact, I was talking about the corium, and this corium actually came out, melted down. It actually had a liquid status and then became solid, and it also looked like a lump, and technically or commonly they were known as elephant's foot. Another interesting point, this disaster resulted in the creation of zirconium. Why? Because these uranium fuel rods are made of uranium oxide and they had zirconium alloy. So when the corium is having sand and concrete, they had huge silica. So this zirconium, silica and oxygen resulted in the production of crystalline zircon, which is zirconium silicate, and which is of course a gemstone. Not very much wide, it was as thick as human hair. So this particular accident resulted in some short-term and long-term impact. As I was telling, that there were some people who were suffering immediately and some people dying. But in the long run, in 10 years' time, there were around 14 people who suffered from acute radiation syndrome and they died. But 9 people died quickly and 2 suffered, or the remaining 5 suffered for a longer period of time from a disease called myelodysplastic syndrome, which is the cancer of the bone marrow producing irregular type of red blood corpuscles. Now, there was also radioactive iodine coming out, as a result of which there was the report of childhood thyroid cancer. Around 4,000 new incidents happened till 2002 in the countries of Belarus, Russia and Ukraine. But another feeling, that is, we call it psychosomatic disorder, they were being suffered by people. People didn't know whether they are having cancer or whether they are having any trace of radiation, but there was a fear of this radiological disease. And this particular population of Ukraine suffering from this radioactive disease or illness, they are called poterpili. And almost it reached 3.5 million, which is almost 5% of the total population of Ukraine. Along with that, in the neighboring country of Belarus, there were 60,000 Belarusian emergency workers, of which about 150.2% died because of cancer or radiation-related damage. This particular accident resulted in the elimination of 14 EBQ, which is a radioactive unit, and it consists of 1.8 EBQ of iodine 131, 0.085 EBQ of 137 caesium, 0.01 EBQ of 90 strontium, 0.003 EBQ of plutonium. And most of the places, almost 200,000 square kilometers of Eastern Europe, they had this 137 CS and 37 kBq of this particular radioactive element is dangerous. So they were above 37, and that is why the incidence of cancer increased. And the 70% of this area is located in Belarus, Russia and Ukraine, where the percentage is more than 37. Most of the strontium and plutonium radioisotopes, they were also deposited about 100-kilometer radius, and they gradually showed radioactive decay. So, if we can see this figure, that particular accident spot denoted in black and deep red is Chernobyl, which has more than 100 EBQ of particular radioactivity. And the wind was blowing from east to the west. So gradually, this particular radioactive particles were taken to different other countries of Germany, France, Spain, even England. And this radioactivity was very high, in the range of 20 to 100. But gradually, after say almost 28 years of the Chernobyl incident, we can see the same place is gradually showing reduction in radiation level, and the maximum radiation was reported around the city of Pripyat, which is around 12 EBQ. So the level has gone down remarkably but has not disappeared, and that is the problem. And in fact, the radiation dose to the first responders of Chernobyl was as high as 800,000 to 1 or 16 into 10 to the power 6 EBQ, which is pretty high. And you can see that this particular dose was much higher than the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011. And of course, it was much higher with respect to the annual level of radiation in different parts of Europe and also in America. So the radiation was high enough to cause death either in a week's time or in 2 weeks' time. Now let us discuss some effect on the agricultural field, because this particular field, they had this radioisotope deposited all over, and there were the grazing animals, and these animals took the radioactive elements, caesium, and they gradually passed it on to the food chain, because the meat was taken, the milk was taken. This is one side of the story. And the other side of the story is the plants also took up. The plants took up these radioactive elements and they deposited in the leaves or in the fruits, and that was also consumed by human. So at the end of the day, the soil got polluted with the absorbed radionuclides and it passed on to human agents. Now let us have a quiz. Which country suffered the most from Chernobyl disaster apart from Ukraine? The options are A. Russia, B. Belarus, C. UK, and D. Poland. And the correct option is B, that is Belarus. Now, let us discuss the fate of the radionuclides. Actually, I have already told you that the decay of radioactive caesium is only taking place in 2.1 years. But it happened in 1986, and till mid-1990 it was very much there. Similarly, strontium-90, it also traveled to wide distances, resulting in the problem. And also the 239 plutonium and 241 americium, they also caused problem in agricultural field, because these particular fields were enriched in organic content and animals were grazing. So it remained for a longer period of time than actually expected, and as a result of which this unimproved pasture was the major source of radionuclide exposure. So this 137 caesium passed on to the milk and meat of the cattle, and it resulted in the food chain effect in human. And it also went into the vegetables. And in fact, there were some town like Gomel, Mogiliev or Belarus, Gomel and Mogiliev in Belarus or Bryansk in Russia, they were suffering the most. Also, the Zhytomyr and Rovno in Ukraine, there the level of radioactive cesium was very high, much higher than the tolerant level. A very interesting point that this radioactivity is not limited to the Eastern European countries. The wind speed was from east to west, as I have already stated, and this wind carried the particular radioactive cesium into England. And we could see in parts of England, Scotland, and also in Wales, there was radioactivity in the cattle animals. Like in 355 farms, more than 180,000 cattle were affected. In England, about 9 farms having 6,600 cattle affected. And of course, 10,700 cattle were affected in and around Scotland. So England also suffered from this Chernobyl disaster. It was not only in the agricultural field, but also in the water. What does it mean? The river water, lake water, all they suffered from this radioactive fallout. As a result of which, this radioactivity is getting into the irrigational water, is affecting the freshwater biota, including the fishes and other aquatic animals, and most importantly, it gets into the drinking water. So slowly and steadily, without knowing, radioactivity is coming inside human body through drinking water. And that was taking place through these 30 years of time. So obviously, they needed some help. And we considered this under recovery projects. The entire world was beside Ukraine. And the Chernobyl Trust Fund was created in 1991 by the United Nations. In 2002, the United Nations Development Program, they provided emergency assistance for the long-term development in Chernobyl. And also, the Chernobyl Shelter Fund was established in 1997 at the G8 Summit in Denver to finance the Shelter Implementation Plan, or SIP, through stabilization of the sarcophagus and construction of new safe confinement. And this particular confinement was managed by organization in Bechtel, France. Again, in 2003, the UNDP, they launched the Chernobyl Recovery and Development Program. We call it CRDP. It helped the government of Ukraine in mitigating long-term social, economic, ecological consequence of Chernobyl catastrophe. In 4 most affected Ukrainian areas, which include Kyievska, Zhytomyrska, Chernihivska, and Rivnenska. About 18,000 Ukrainian children suffering from this disaster have been treated in the resort town of Tarara since 1990. The international project on the health effects of Chernobyl accident was created, and they received $20 million from Japan, mainly with respect to the damages caused and recovery from radioactive iodine, that is iodine 131 radiation. In 2019, the Ukrainian government, under the leadership of Zelensky, the president, they opened Chernobyl as a tourist attraction. So that was a remarkable decision. I'll come to that at a later time. This particular incident opened a huge radioactive debate. It raised the concern over these fission reactors worldwide, and the radioactive nuclear reactor 5 and 6, which was under construction was stalled. And at a later time, the Chernobyl power plant was shut down. In fact, the Soviet nuclear power industry became very slow and they became less secretive because they understood that in order to open this particular forum to other countries only can reduce the suffering of the people. And maybe this particular incident resulted in the glasnost, that is, paved the way for reforms, and that ultimately led to the breaking of the Soviet Union. Similarly, in Italy, nuclear power plants were phased out from 1988, though it was temporarily reversed in 2008, and also it was stalled in 2011 because of people's movement. So people also understood it is no longer a safe power. Similarly, in Germany, there was this Federal Environment Ministry created under the leadership of Angela Merkel, who later became the Chancellor. And they reversed the nuclear power plants made between 1998 till 2005 by the Schroeder government. Similarly, convention of early notification of nuclear accident was made mandatory by the International Atomic Energy Agency after Chernobyl. There was huge cultural impact. There were books, films made. This is a famous film, Chernobyl series, shown in HBO. The writer, Svetlana Alexandrovna Alexeyevich from Belarus, wrote the book Chernobyl, or Voices of Chernobyl, for which she was awarded Nobel Prize in 2015. The Ukrainian artist Roman Gumaniuk created a series of artwork called Pripyat Lights or Chernobyl Shadows, and there were about 30 oil paintings on Chernobyl accident, which were exhibited all over the world in Europe and other countries. The video game Stalker came into existence, which was based on this Chernobyl incident or Shadows of Chernobyl. Similarly, there was a film by Hollywood, Chernobyl Diaries, released in 2012, where 6 tourists hired a tour guide and went to the abandoned city of Pripyat and found that they were not alone. There was also another Oscar-winning film, The Chernobyl Heart, that was released in 2003. Most interestingly, there was a film or documentary, The Babuskas or Babusakas of Chernobyl, which was released in 2015, which stated about 3 brave women who decided to return to the exclusion zone much after the disaster, knowing fully well there is a chance of radioactive exposure. Finally, as I was telling, Ukrainian president in 2019 July opened Chernobyl as a tourist attraction spot. And it continued for around 3 years, and then it was stopped again because of this ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. But of course, there was a word of caution given by T. Steen. Dr. Steen is actually a professor of microbiology and immunology in the Georgetown School of Medicine, where she stated that the tourists, if they go to Chernobyl, they should wear proper clothes, completely covered. And they also should be protecting themselves from different objects which may be radioactive. They should avoid plant life. They should not get into the deeper forest, which are probable source of radiation. Now, the most interesting event occurred in 2022, February, 24th February. the Russian troops attacked Ukraine. And different parts were occupied, and that also included the Chernobyl. So, this particular town was under Russian siege for 5 weeks. Finally, they also understood the danger of radioactive exposure and withdrew their army. The Russian army was withdrawn on 31st March. But according to BBC News, the monitoring stations around that area of Chernobyl recorded 20-fold increase in radiation level up to 65 μs volume per hour. And this μsievert per hour is quite high. And they said, a research team from the University of Sheffield stated that this particular radioactivity was mainly kicked up by the marching army or the armed vehicles in that particular area. So this radioactive dust would continue for a longer period of time following the war of Russia-Ukraine. Now it's time for the second quiz. The Chernobyl was opened to tourists in the year option A 2002, option B 2010, option C 2016, and option D is 2019 or 2019. And the correct option is D, that is 2019. So in this particular lecture, what I have discussed is the disaster of Chernobyl, the cause of the disaster, the different long-term and short-term effect, the damages in the surrounding, the impact on agriculture, on cattle, on wild animals, on the food chain, and finally getting into human, how humans suffered, and the spreading of this radiation to other countries in the Western Europe because of the wind speed. I also discussed the global nuclear issues. People became cautious. People became concerned. And they understood that radioactivity is not the only safe power. They also had cultural impact in the form of films and books. And of course, video shows, video games. And there was also the global aid coming to Chernobyl or coming to Ukraine for the recovery, for the help of the suffered people. And finally, I have concluded with the recent war of Ukraine-Russia, which resulted in reactivation of radioactivity in that particular region of Ukraine.